Some children grow up learning who they are. Others grow up learning who they should have been. They hear it in small comparisons, disguised as motivation. Why can't you be more like them? Look how easily they succeed. See how well they behave. Over time, the child stops listening to their own inner signals. They begin measuring themselves instead, against siblings, against classmates, against an invisible standard that always seems just out of reach. Comparison becomes the language of love, approval, and worth, and the child learns that being themselves is never quite enough. This story is not about jealousy or competition. It is about identity, about what happens when self-worth is built externally, about the quiet erosion of self-trust, and about the long psychological echo of growing up always measured, never simply seen. This is the psychology of the child who was always compared. Some children learn who they are by listening inward. Others learn who they are by watching others. For the child who was always compared, awareness begins early, not with curiosity but with calculation. They notice how attention shifts, how praise arrives selectively, how love seems to follow performance rather than presence. Comparison does not always come harshly. Often, it arrives softly, wrapped in encouragement, a comment about someone else's success, a reminder of what is possible, a suggestion to try harder, framed as care. But the child hears the message beneath the words, "You are not enough as you are." At first, the child responds instinctively. They try to improve. They imitate. They adjust themselves to match what seems rewarded. They look outward for reference points. A sibling who excels, a classmate who is praised, a cousin whose achievements are recounted often. Slowly, the child begins to understand that value is comparative. That worth is relative. That being loved or noticed depends on how well they measure up. This realization does not form as thought, it forms as feeling. A tightening in the chest when someone else is praised, a quiet disappointment when effort goes unnoticed, a subtle anxiety before evaluations, performances, or conversations. The child starts monitoring themselves constantly. Am I doing enough? Am I better or worse than them? Where do I stand right now? Identity becomes unstable. Instead of developing from inner preference or curiosity, it is constructed externally, assembled from feedback, rankings, and reactions. The child learns to anticipate comparison even when it is not spoken. They imagine it, they rehearse against it, they brace for it. Eventually, comparison no longer requires an external voice. The child internalizes it. They become their own evaluator, their own critic, their own judge. Even moments of success feel temporary. Relief replaces joy, because success only means safety for now. There is always someone ahead, always another metric, always a next comparison waiting. The child may become driven, ambitious, high-achieving, or they may withdraw, avoiding competition, avoiding visibility, avoiding the pain of being measured at all. Both responses come from the same place, a belief that being oneself is not sufficient. This constant measurement erodes something subtle but essential: self-trust. The child stops asking, "What do I enjoy?" They start asking, "What will be approved?" Desires are edited, preferences are questioned, authenticity is delayed. They become skilled at adapting, but uncertain of who they are when no one is watching. Comparison also shapes emotional safety. Mistakes feel heavier, failure feels personal, not as information, but as evidence. Evidence that they are falling behind, evidence that they are losing worth. Over time, the child's inner world becomes a scoreboard. Thoughts tally performance, emotions react to perceived ranking. Peace is conditional. It depends on doing better than before, better than someone else. This chapter is not about fault. The caregivers may not intend harm. The comparisons may come from fear, cultural pressure, or a belief in motivation through competition. But the child does not experience intention, they experience impact. They experience what it feels like to be seen through a lens of comparison rather than understanding, to be measured rather than known. And this is how the child learns to measure themselves, not by inner alignment, but by external reference. This learning sets the stage for everything that follows: the origins of comparison, the psychology behind it, and the long journey toward reclaiming a self that was never meant to be ranked. Comparison rarely begins with cruelty. It begins with anxiety. A parent worries about the child's future. A teacher fears falling standards. A family carries unspoken expectations shaped by culture, scarcity, or survival. And so, comparison enters quietly, as guidance, as pressure, as a way of saying, "I want you to do well," without knowing how else to express it. Many caregivers were themselves compared. They grew up learning that worth was earned through achievement, obedience, or excellence. They internalized the belief that pressure produces success, without reflection. Sometimes comparison is woven into sibling dynamics. One child is labeled the smart one, another becomes the responsible one, a third is creative or difficult. These labels may seem harmless, even affectionate, but they divide attention. They turn family into a hierarchy rather than a sanctuary. The child learns quickly where they stand, who receives praise easily, who is corrected often, Who is held up as an example? Comparison also thrives in environments where performance is emphasized over presence. Schools that reward ranking, communities that equate success with visible outcomes, cultures that measure value through productivity, obedience, or status. In these spaces, children are rarely asked how they feel. They are asked how they perform. Comparison becomes a shared language: grades, scores, awards, progress reports. The child learns that identity is something to prove. Even subtle remarks leave marks. Your brother never struggled with this. She's always been so confident. Why can't you be more focused like them? Each comparison adds another layer of pressure, another mirror that reflects inadequacy. In some families, comparison is framed as motivation. The belief is simple: if the child sees what is possible, they will strive harder. But children do not experience comparison as possibility. They experience it as evaluation. They do not hear you can grow, they hear you are lacking. The origins of comparison often lie in fear of falling behind, fear of failure, fear of social judgment. Caregivers may believe they are preparing the child for a competitive world, but the child learns something else instead. That love is conditional, that safety depends on performance, that rest is earned only after success. Comparison can also emerge when caregivers are emotionally unavailable. When attention is scarce, children compete for it. When affirmation is inconsistent, children compare themselves to understand why. In these environments, comparison fills the gap left by connection. It explains why one child feels seen and another feels invisible. The child who is always compared does not experience themselves as whole. They experience themselves as relative. Their sense of self is shaped by proximity, to approval, to praise, to what is deemed better. This chapter is not about blame. Most caregivers do not intend to wound. They are often repeating patterns they never question. But intention does not erase impact. The child absorbs the environment they grow in. They internalize its values. They build their identity from the feedback they receive most consistently. And when comparison becomes the dominant feedback, the child's inner voice becomes comparative too. This is the soil where insecurity grows, where perfectionism takes root, where self-worth becomes unstable. Understanding where comparison begins allows compassion to emerge for the child who endured it and for the systems that normalized it. But understanding alone is not enough. To heal, the psychology behind comparison must be explored. In the next chapter, we will look at how constant comparison shapes the brain, motivation, and self-esteem, and why it creates a life lived under measurement rather than meaning. The human mind learns who it is through reflection, not only through mirrors but through other people. In early development, children form their sense of self by observing how they are responded to: tone, attention, facial expression, praise, correction. When comparison becomes the primary feedback, the brain adapts accordingly. Psychology calls this social comparison theory, the idea that people determine their value by measuring themselves against others. In moderation, comparison can orient behavior. In excess, especially during childhood, it destabilizes identity. For the child who is always compared, the brain learns that worth is external, not felt, not intrinsic, but assigned. This changes how motivation forms. Instead of being driven by curiosity or enjoyment, the child becomes driven by evaluation. They do not ask, "Do I like this?" They ask, "Will this make me look competent?" The brain's reward system reinforces this pattern. Praise releases dopamine. Comparison-based approval creates brief relief. But relief fades quickly because it is conditional. This leads to a cycle. Effort, evaluation, temporary validation, renewed anxiety. The nervous system stays activated, always preparing for the next comparison. Success does not bring rest. It brings pressure to maintain position. Failure, even minor, triggers disproportionate shame. Not because the task matters, but because identity feels at stake. Self-esteem in this context becomes fragile. It fluctuates with feedback. It depends on performance. It lacks a stable internal reference. Over time, the child develops an external locus of evaluation. They rely on others to tell them how they are doing, how they are valued, how they rank. This dependence weakens self-trust. The brain becomes skilled at scanning for cues: who is ahead, who is praised, who is falling behind. This scanning is not conscious. It is automatic. Neuroimaging studies show that chronic comparison activates areas associated with threat detection and social pain. The brain interprets comparison not as neutral information, but as risk of exclusion, risk of rejection, risk of diminished worth. This is why comparison feels so personal. In children whose identities are still forming, this effect is amplified. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for perspective and regulation, is not yet fully developed. Emotion dominates interpretation, so comparison is felt, not reasoned. The child does not think, "This is just feedback." They feel, "I am less." Over time, this shapes personality traits that appear unrelated on the surface. Perfectionism, people-pleasing, imposter syndrome, avoidance of competition or visibility. All of these emerge from the same psychological root, the belief that worth must be earned repeatedly. Interestingly, the brain also learns to compare internally. The child splits into parts: who they are now and who they should be. The should self becomes idealized, unreachable, and constantly shifting. The present self feels perpetually behind. This internal comparison is exhausting. It creates chronic dissatisfaction. Even in moments of success, the mind moves the goalpost. Psychologically, this erodes joy. Achievement is no longer experienced as fulfillment, but as relief. Rest feels undeserved, stillness feels unsafe. Understanding this mechanism is crucial, because it reveals that the struggle is not lack of ability or discipline. It is the nervous system operating under constant evaluation. The child who was always compared did not fail to develop confidence. Confidence was never allowed to form internally. It was outsourced, and what is outsourced must always be reclaimed externally through praise, approval, superiority, or achievement. This is why awareness matters, because once the mechanism is seen, it can be questioned. In the next chapter, we will explore how this psychological structure creates an inner conflict, a split between authenticity and performance, between desire and expectation, between who the child became and who they were never allowed to be. When a child is always compared, identity does not form as a single, coherent sense of self. It divides. There is the self that exists naturally, curious, emotional, imperfect, intuitive. And there is the self that is performed, polished, strategic, shaped by expectation. Over time, the performed self becomes dominant. The child learns which version of themselves is rewarded, which traits bring praise, which behaviors draw approval, which qualities lead to silence or disappointment. Slowly, they begin editing themselves. Authenticity becomes risky. Spontaneity feels unsafe. Desire is questioned before it is expressed. The child starts living in anticipation of evaluation. Before speaking, they consider how it will be received. Before choosing, they calculate outcomes. Before resting, they assess whether rest is deserved. This creates a split identity. On the outside, there may be competence, achievement, adaptability, charm. On the inside, there is uncertainty, a persistent question: am I enough without proving it? This internal division is exhausting. The child becomes highly attuned to others' expectations, but disconnected from their own needs. They may struggle to answer simple questions about preference. What do you want? What do you enjoy? What matters to you? Because for so long, those answers were shaped externally. Perfectionism often emerges here, not as a desire for excellence, but as protection. If everything is done perfectly, comparison loses its power, at least temporarily. But perfection is a moving target. There is always someone better, always a higher standard, always another metric. So the pressure never lifts. People-pleasing can also develop. The child learns that harmony and approval reduce the pain of comparison. They become agreeable, accommodating, and attentive to others' needs, sometimes at the expense of their own boundaries. Imposter syndrome often follows, because the performed self never feels real. Achievements feel borrowed, praise feels undeserved. The child, now adult, may think, if they really knew me, they would see I don't measure up. This belief persists even in success. There is also resistance. At times, the individual may reject comparison entirely. They withdraw from competitive spaces, avoid visibility, downplay ambition. But this resistance is still shaped by comparison. It is a reaction to being measured, not freedom from it. The split identity creates chronic tension. The nervous system remains alert. The mind oscillates between striving and withdrawal. Neither brings peace. Moments of rest are interrupted by self-evaluation. Moments of joy are tempered by guilt. Moments of achievement are followed by fear of decline. The child who is always compared grows into an adult who struggles to feel settled within themselves. They may appear confident but internally feel provisional. They may succeed but feel unseen. They may be admired but not feel known. This chapter is not about pathology. It is about adaptation. The split identity was not a mistake. It was a solution, a way to survive in an environment where being oneself was not enough. But solutions that save us early can constrain us later. The inner conflict begins to soften only when the adult notices the split, when they see the difference between who they are and who they learn to be. That noticing is the beginning of change. In the next chapter, the story turns inward toward awareness, the moment when the individual recognizes that comparison shaped their identity and begins to grieve the self that was never fully allowed to emerge. The moment of awareness does not arrive with clarity. It arrives with discomfort. A quiet unease settles in, often during success, not failure. The achievement is there, the recognition arrives, and yet something feels hollow. The adult notices that even when they win, the relief is brief, satisfaction dissolves quickly. The mind moves on, scanning for the next comparison. This is often the first crack. They begin to ask questions that feel unfamiliar. Why does this never feel like enough? Why am I exhausted even when I'm doing well? Why does approval matter so much more than it should? These questions are unsettling because they point inward, toward a truth that has been avoided for a long time. Slowly, memory surfaces. A parent's voice comparing them to a sibling. A teacher's praise that always came with a reference point, a household where attention followed performance, a childhood where being better meant being safer. The adult realizes something quietly profound. Comparison was not just something that happened to them, it shaped them. What once felt like personality, ambition, sensitivity to feedback, relentless self-monitoring, begins to look like adaptation. This realization brings grief, not dramatic grief, not explosive emotion, but a steady ache. Grief for the child who never got to be enough without proving it, grief for interests abandoned because they were not impressive, grief for rest postponed, joy delayed, curiosity interrupted. There is sadness in recognizing how early the inner critic appeared. How young the child was when they began evaluating themselves instead of exploring. How love and approval became something to earn rather than receive. Alongside grief comes anger, often muted, often delayed. Anger that worth was measured. Anger that comparison was mistaken for motivation. Anger that safety felt conditional. But this anger is usually turned inward. The adult feels it as self-blame rather than protest. Why am I like this? Why can't I just be satisfied? Why do I always feel behind? Awareness begins to redirect this blame. The adult starts to see that the problem was not lack of discipline or gratitude. It was the environment that taught them to outsource worth. This shift is subtle but powerful. Instead of asking, how do I become better? They begin asking, who am I without comparison? That question can feel frightening, because comparison has been the organizing principle of identity for so long. Without it, there is emptiness, uncertainty, space, and space can feel unsafe when one is used to constant measurement. This is why the moment of awareness is both freeing and destabilizing. The adult may feel lost for a time, goals lose their urgency, motivation wavers, direction feels unclear. But this is not regression, it is decompression. The psyche is adjusting to the absence of constant evaluation. For the first time, the individual glimpses the possibility that worth does not need to be negotiated. That identity can exist without reference. That value does not rise or fall based on comparison. This realization does not immediately heal, but it creates choice. Choice to notice when comparison arises. Choice to pause before measuring. Choice to question the voice that says you are only as good as your position. The moment of awareness is not an ending. It is an opening toward grief, honesty, and eventually integration. In the next chapter, we will explore how healing begins, not through striving, but through reclaiming inner authority. How the child who was always compared slowly learns to trust their own internal compass again. Healing does not arrive as confidence. It arrives as quiet permission. Permission to pause before reacting. Permission to question the voice that rushes to measure. Permission to sit with uncertainty without immediately ranking it. For the adult who was always compared, healing begins when authority slowly moves inward. For most of their life, worth lived outside the self, in reactions, in approval, in being chosen, praised, or positioned favorably against someone else. Comparison was the compass. Without it, direction felt impossible. So integration is not about silencing comparison entirely. That would be unrealistic. The mind learned this language early. It will return out of habit, especially under stress. Healing begins when comparison is no longer believed automatically. When the thought arises, they're doing better than me, it is met with curiosity instead of obedience. Not resistance, not self-correction, just noticing. This is the subtle work. The adult begins to differentiate between evaluation and identity, performance and worth, outcome and existence. This separation feels unnatural at first, because they were once fused. As a child, being less than often meant being less safe, less visible, less loved, so the nervous system learned to stay alert, to monitor, to anticipate judgment before it arrived. Healing teaches the body something new, that nothing collapses when comparison is ignored. That safety does not disappear when performance pauses. That rest does not lead to abandonment. This learning happens slowly, through lived experience, not insight alone. Moments where nothing is proven and nothing is lost. Moments where joy appears without usefulness. Moments where preference exists without justification. The adult begins to notice a new sensation, internal reference. Instead of asking, how does this look? The question becomes, how does this feel? Instead of, is this impressive? It becomes, is this honest? This shift is fragile. It requires gentleness. Because the old system will protest. There will be guilt for not striving, fear of falling behind, discomfort in choosing something simply because it resonates. But slowly, something stabilizes. A sense of self that does not need witnesses. The adult starts recognizing desires that were buried under expectation. Interests that were never pursued because they lacked prestige. Preferences that were dismissed because they couldn't be compared. Integration is the act of letting those parts exist without needing validation, not turning them into achievements, not defending them, just allowing them space. This is where inner authority forms, not as certainty, but as trust. Trust that internal signals matter, trust that worth is not negotiable, trust that being enough does not require contrast. The adult also begins to grieve less sharply. The pain of comparison softens into understanding. The parents were often compared to. The system was larger than the household. The pattern was inherited, not invented. This does not excuse harm, but it releases the child from carrying it alone. Healing is not about rewriting the past, it is about reclaiming the present, choosing experiences that are self-referenced, relationships that do not rely on hierarchy, moments where presence replaces performance. Over time, the inner critic loses urgency, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer in charge. The adult learns something profoundly stabilizing. They do not need to be the best version of themselves, they only need to be present with the one they are. This is integration, not becoming exceptional, but becoming whole. In the final chapter, the story will return to quiet reflection, to what remains when comparison loosens its grip, and the child who was measured finally stands without scale. There is a moment often unnoticed when comparison finally grows tired. Not defeated, not erased, just quieter. It no longer arrives with urgency, no longer demands answers, no longer defines the shape of the day. For the child who was always compared, adulthood becomes a slow unlearning of measurement. Not a rejection of ambition, not a retreat from growth, but a release from constant evaluation. Life begins to feel wider when it is no longer ranked. The adult starts to notice how often comparison once interrupted presence, how joy was postponed until it could be justified, how rest felt undeserved without productivity, how peace required permission. Without the scale, moments stand on their own. A morning without proving, a conversation without positioning, a decision made quietly, without needing it to look impressive. These moments are small, but they accumulate. What emerges is not a louder self, but a truer one. This self does not need to be exceptional to feel valid. It does not scan rooms for comparison targets. It does not narrate its worth internally. It simply exists. There is a softness in this existence and also strength, because a person who no longer defines themselves by comparison cannot be easily destabilized. They are less reactive, less performative, less afraid of others' success. They can admire without diminishing themselves. They can witness achievement without self-erasure. They can fail without collapse. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional grounding. The child who is always compared learned to survive by watching others. The adult who heals learns to live by listening inward. There is still growth, still curiosity, still desire, but it is no longer fueled by inadequacy. It is fueled by alignment, by the quiet sense of, this matters to me, even if it cannot be ranked, optimized, or explained. The world continues to compare. Systems still reward visibility. Metrics still dominate. Healing does not require escape from this reality. It requires a different relationship with it. The adult learns to step in and out of comparison consciously, to participate without surrendering identity, to observe without absorbing. This is maturity, not superiority, not detachment, but discernment. Over time, the memory of the compared child changes. They are no longer seen as weak or broken. They are understood as adaptive. They learn to read environments early, to adjust, to strive. Those skills do not disappear. They are simply recontextualized, used selectively, not constantly. The child is no longer tasked with earning worth. They are allowed to rest. And in that rest, something profound settles, a sense of enoughness, not as belief, but as experience. Enough time, enough presence, enough self. The adult realizes that identity was never meant to be measured. It was meant to be inhabited. And the most meaningful lives are rarely the most impressive ones. They are the most integrated. Lives where comparison no longer narrates the story, where worth is not borrowed, where the inner voice speaks without interference. But it is finally set down, and the child who once stood beneath it, weighed, evaluated, adjusted, steps forward without numbers, not to prove anything, but to live, quietly, fully, as themselves. This is the end of comparison's reign, not with resistance, but with understanding, and what remains is not perfection, but peace.